Recently, I was lucky enough to be blessed by Fujifilm with the new GFX Eterna 55 for a week, and I wanted to put it to as much use as possible, and basically I broke it down into 3 different use cases. So my first shoot was completely run and gun, no control over the lighting or the environment, moving super fast, almost no time to set things up. So I kind of wanted to see how it would perform in that environment. The second shoot was kind of the opposite, where we actually took time to light, production design, compose things more thoughtfully. And then the third shoot was more of a hybrid, where we didn't necessarily have many resources, but we had a good amount of time to kind of just focus on compositions and go hard with the lensing. So I felt like these 3 levels of shooting would kind of give me a good idea of how this camera performs, in a broad sense. Alright, for the first one, it was a live runway show, and then we also shot some BTS backstage. It kind of challenged me to dial in the correct exposure on the fly. I was kind of getting used to their on-screen waveform. There was live lighting cues in this runway show, and they didn't really give us a proper lighting rehearsal, so I was literally racking the iris on the fly, which I don't love. But again, that was a good test to kind of see how the dynamic range held up. I tried to stay at 800 ISO. There's a slight bit of grain in the blacks, but nothing unusable. We had the zero optic rehoused Nikkor 58mm, which was beautiful. Shout out to Scheim Flug, Daniel at Flug. Kind of convinced me to take a look at this lens, and then once I saw it, I had to have it. When I was backstage, I swapped to some Angenieux Optimal primes for some close-ups, which also covered the entire sensor at the GF mode. For the most part, there was a tiny bit of vignette. Super happy with how the camera performed in the kind of fast run and gun situation, built-in NDs. The actual build of the body is super user-friendly and ergonomic. Menus on both sides of the camera. Some things could be streamlined with the actual internal menu systems themselves, but to be fair, I only had the camera for a week and even less at that point, so maybe it just takes some time to get used to. The low light performance, I think it needs a little bit of work. It wasn't to a point where I couldn't use any of the footage. Okay, so the second shoot allowed us to really test out the color science on this sensor and see how the camera itself performed in a more commercial setting. So I'm absolutely in love with the image. I think it's beautiful, again, especially in a more portrait setting like we used it for here. We threw it on Steadicam for some movement, and again, I gotta say the menus took a little bit of time to get used to as we set up for steady. We also had a problem outputting a signal to our Steadicam monitor, which I cannot definitively say is an issue with the camera, but just perhaps worth noting. We were using the Mamiya 645s, which fully covered the sensor with no vignette, and then for some of these bathroom shots, we switched to the Helios 44-2 58mm, which I'm just absolutely in love with. It's funny because during the testing this week, we used glass that was $146 side by side with glass that was about $25,000 per lens, which is insane. In here, I was a bit worried about some digital noise because the bathroom was so tight, we only had room for one head. We just shot a Nova 300 panel with a softbox into the ceiling. I ended up pushing the ISO to about 1250 here, and I think I might have bumped it to 1600 for a couple of the shots. After processing it in post in DaVinci, I even pushed the low end up a little bit in the contrast curve, and it completely held up.
The lighting is literally perfect right now. Let's shoot.
All right, so for the last shoot, this is a scenario where we're testing to see how the sensor performs on its own without much help. We were also testing out a couple different crop modes, so we were able to use a couple different lenses. Here it is with the Angenieux 75mm Optimal Prime. Absolutely beautiful focus fall off. Not quite Panavision level, but looks great on this sensor. Super happy with the colors, and you know, on that note, it's been a little bit of a task to figure out the post-production color workflow with this camera. I shot everything in F-Log 2C, and when I used the LUTs directly from the Fuji website, it was still looking a bit flat in DaVinci, but again, that's not to say it's a camera problem. Maybe it's just gonna take me a minute to figure out that proper workflow. Here it is in the Premista crop mode with the Ingenue 28 to 70 mm zoom. This is technically a Super 35 mm piece of glass, but just for reference, it's secretly in between full frame and Super 35. When I put the Fuji cam in the Premista mode and I shot with a 4x3 guide on, the lens covered basically all of the sensor by the time I put on a quick stabilizer and just a slight punch in. You know, it's fully covering. So overall, the camera performs super well in this more hybrid setting. You're kind of letting the colors and the composition and, you know, the sensor overall speak for itself because there's no fancy lighting, it's all natural. If I had my dream wish list, I think the LUT output via the SDI was a little tricky. In some of the modes, I wasn't actually able to output a LUT via SDI when I wanted to shoot and record log on the card. I think there's a bit of a learning curve with this camera because there are so many combinations of settings between the crop modes and the resolutions. Certain ones support look in the SDI output, certain ones either don't, or I'm not sure where to find it. So that was a little tricky. Overall, I was super happy with it, and if you ask me would I use this camera again, I would genuinely pay to rent this camera for the right job, you know, especially at the price point that it's at. It takes beautiful portraits, beautiful color science. That medium format look is just beautiful. So thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.